What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to another episode of America Trends. I'm Larry Rifkin, and my buddy, my partner, John Krofsick is with me. Hey, John, I want to talk about today's college students. I saw this opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal from Jonathan Haidt, and he's an interesting guy, Jonathan Haidt. We had him on the radio program some years ago, and he writes, today's college students also are tomorrow's leaders and employees. Companies are already encountering problems with recent graduates unprepared for the challenges of the workplace. Work requires a certain amount of toughness, Mr. Haidt said. Colleges that prepare students to expect a frictionless environment where there are bureaucratic procedures and adult authorities to rectify conflict are very poorly prepared for the workplace. So we can expect a lot more litigation in the coming years. Now, maybe that's true. I don't know. I think millennials are really an interesting group. You and I both have fathered millennials, and I think they're really a good group. I really do.
Well, I think so, too. But then you hear the news and how in colleges you got to have safe zones so you can't. I mean, I don't know. I really don't know if it's the kids as much as it's the colleges themselves.
Aha. Well, that is a perfect lead-in to today's podcast and our episode. And this is going to be a good one. This is going to be a good one. So I want to give you a quiz since we're talking about college. One school in America has such a reputation that when you hear it, you assume these qualities in terms of the kids and what's being taught there. I mean, really pretty heavy thunk. Okay. You think brilliance. You think that these are going to be the future leaders of America. There's one word. Do you know which college I'm referring to?
It's got to be Yale.
Yale?
No.
Now, look, you and I live in Connecticut. We've always lived in Connecticut. There have been so many stories about how Yale just really can't compete. I mean, it's a great school, obviously, but because it's in New Haven and because it really isn't number one in certain areas, though, look, there have been some great people who've come out of Yale and such, but there's another school just up the road.
Harvard.
Harvard?
Harvard. Oh,
yeah.
Watch that.
How do you get to Harvard? You turn right at Brookline. Well, listen, even their graduates and their dropouts are successful. You don't even have to graduate from Harvard. Just say you went there. We're going to
visit.
Well, just to visit, just drive by. And all that ambience just hits you right in the face. Look, our buddy John LeBoutelier, I mean, he wrote a book back in 1978, Harvard Hates America. It was a little cheeky. We got to have John on the show. We love John.
We do.
You know, he's great.
He can tell us about Harvard.
He can. And I got to tell you, I was in this cottage up in New Hampshire visiting some friends, and the wife and my wife are very friendly. And he took out this yearbook, Brad, and he was showing me the yearbook of his father who went to Harvard. And it was really interesting because in that same class, and I've forgotten the year, I mean, there was Joe Kennedy Jr., and of course he was the one who was really supposed to be the president. And of course he was killed in World War II, a pilot, the handsomest of all the Kennedys. I mean, this guy was remarkable. But then he started leafing through this yearbook, and you saw secretaries of state, secretaries of defense. I mean, it was absolutely remarkable, the leadership that comes out of Harvard. It's fantastic.
Wow.
I was really impressed. Yeah. Honestly, I mean, when you think about it. So, again, you and I are more comfortable. We know our way around Yale, but Harvard is really the place. And I got to tell you, a couple of years ago, I went up to a class at Harvard, and it was given by a man.
You've been there.
Well, I've been, yeah. I mean, I was auditing the class. I really wasn't accepted on any level. Trust me. My UConn graduation didn't really give me any of those bona fides. But I was looking to do a program for PBS, which we ultimately did, on happiness. And that was all the rage back about 9-10 years ago. And there was an incredible course on the campus taught by Tal Ben-Shahar on happiness. And it was allegedly at the time the most popular course at Harvard. So he was talking about what it really takes to be happy, and it's not money and this, that, and the other. It's not your titles, because once you've acquired enough of that, you still have to have something to underpin it. But at any rate, Tal was a wonderful man. We did the show. It did very well for PBS. But now I am told that there is something else on campus that is causing quite a stir. It's not about happiness.
And it's
anymore.
not happiness.
No, happiness was yesterday, and it was just an illusion. So now we're talking about how do we live? You know, these kids are searching, even though they are going to be the leaders of the free world. These kids who come out of Harvard, evidently, they're still searching, John. So we're not the only ones on that little journey. Well, we took a couple of dead ends, a couple of detours, cul-de-sacs. But
can't always trust that GPS.
I know. Well, you and I didn't have any GPS. These kids have a direction. At least their legacy and their trusts are requiring them. You must have a direction, son. But there's this professor, Michael Puett, who is on the staff, who now has the third most popular course after basics in various subjects, but really it's the hottest course on the campus. And when I was watching one of the videos of Michael Puett, I saw the same lecture hall where I went to see Tal Ben-Shahar, because it had to be a big one, and it was beautiful with the wood paneling and really looked like Harvard. So he's got this book out called The Path. And what Chinese philosophers, that's easy for me to say.
Yeah, there you go. What
Chinese philosophers can teach us about the good life. And he wrote it with Christine Gross Lowe. And it's an acclaimed international bestseller. And the kids who are taking this course are really supposedly seeing their whole worldview change as a result of going back to something like Confucius. What was that? What did I say?
Confucius.
Or am I just confused?
Or it's confusion.
Confusion.
Yeah.
But, I mean, think about it. I mean, we're going back, what is it, 551 BC?
Way back.
I mean, way back in time. And evidently, he is able to demonstrate that it's not like putting yourself in a straitjacket. It's not like you're adhering to some authority above, because that doesn't sound like kids today would accept a message that said you've got to follow this strict regimen. Right. And he'll explain all this to us, but he's a remarkable guy. And I saw him speaking in front of folks at Google and TED Talks. I mean, he's everywhere, this guy. Fascinating.
Interesting.
Yeah. Let's get him on the show.
All right. Sounds good.
Michael Puett, it is so great to have you with us. The book is called The Path, What Chinese Philosophers Can Teach Us About the Good Life. And, of course, based on this course that you've been teaching at Harvard. And I was up at Harvard some years back getting ready to do a PBS special with Tal Ben-Shahar. And at that time, his course at Harvard on happiness was just the rage on campus. Yours is now the rage. Explain what it is that you thought would happen when you offered this course.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I thought I might get 30, 40 students who were interested in the ins and outs of Chinese philosophy. And on the contrary, as you said, it's really generated a lot of interest. And I think it's because the ideas really challenge the students. They challenge a lot of the fundamental assumptions of the students. And I'm excited to say the students like to be challenged, and they find these ideas really invigorating.
It would seem that a lot of the kids who are going to Harvard have plotted out their own course, or many of them with their legacies and their trusts and the expectations that are put on them, that they've got a certain worldview that's come down from their father and their mother and so forth. Are they open to a lot of these new ideas?
Intriguingly, yes. And I think it's in part for the reasons you've mentioned, that it tends to be a group that's been told a certain thing, a certain ideology about themselves, a certain view about what they should be doing with their lives. And I think they find it very exciting to be told that maybe some of this should be rethought, and maybe some of the assumptions they've been making should be challenged. And they tend to push back a little bit, and yet they tend to find it very exciting, and they keep coming back.
Absolutely. And John and I were talking in our introduction that so many of these people that you're teaching, and that's why we wanted to do it for America Trends podcast, are going to be leaders in government, in business, in many fields, nonprofits and others. What do you hope, as a result of their introduction to Chinese philosophy and applying it to their lives, what is it that you're hoping about their stint in whatever major endeavor they're undertaking? How will it be different as a result of this?
Well, my hope is that if some of them do become leaders, they'll become leaders that will hopefully help us be moving toward building a more cosmopolitan world, a world where we are more engaged with the world, more interested in learning from other peoples in the world, more interested in what can be gained by having fundamental ideas challenged by other people and vice versa. And my hope is it will help direct us toward a much more global cosmopolitan world.
Well, let's get into some of the thought process. We think of ourselves, of course, as being really calculating and very logical in all the decisions that we make. But you say, quote, the way we think we're living our lives isn't the way we live them. The way we think we make decisions isn't how we make them. Our emotions and instincts take over in these situations. Explain that to us.
Absolutely. So we love to think that we are these individuals with free will deciding for ourselves what we want to do based on our best interests and who we really are. And if you accept, and I certainly do, some of these ideas from China, they would say, well, actually what we are as creatures, at least at our worst, are creatures who fall into habits and patterns of behavior that are largely based upon our emotions, our desires, that fall into these rigid ways of interacting. And when we think we're making a decision, oftentimes what we're doing is just playing out a standard habit that may be based more in our fears, our concerns, our anxieties. And even when we say, I made this decision that was good for me, well, maybe I made that decision because I feared for things that would have pushed me out of my comfort zone, and I chose the thing that was the easiest thing for me to do because of my habits of thinking.
Explain to us the whole notion, which I thought was so interesting, that we all are bringing a bundle of messy stuff to every relationship. And that messy stuff then interacts with the other guy or the other gal's messy stuff. And that sounds like a real mess. Explain to us what you're trying to tell us about our lives.
It is indeed a messy, messy, messy mess. and we love to tell ourselves that, first of all, with myself, I should be looking within and finding myself and always trying to be true and sincere to who I really am, loving myself for who I am. And in relationships, we tend to think the same thing. I want to be with someone who is equally true to themselves. And then I'm trying to find a relationship in which the two of us interact well because of who we are. So if I'm, an introvert, I should date an extrovert, or if I want to date another introvert, that's fine too. But I'm sort of trying to decide who I am and what is the sort of person I would relate to. So what if we're wrong in this? So what if we are really these messy creatures, a mess of different emotions and dispositions, and yes, we tend to fall into kind of habits and patterns of thinking, but those can be very dangerous. And if this is true, what you really are striving to do is break out of these habits and patterns, try to grow in your relationships, grow in ways that you could not imagine, and that means accepting that we are messy, the people we're with are messy, we are falling into dangerous patterns that we're hopefully breaking each other out of, but the excitement of a relationship should be the messy work, not this belief that each of us is just a single thing and we either are or are not working in a relationship because we do or do not mesh based on who we somehow essentially are.
Do we go back to something like ancestral cleansing, which is, I know, one of the topics that lots of people address these days, where we're a bundle of messes based on generations past, and we get into the same habitual places that those who raised us have fallen into?
And certainly, among the patterns that can really define us are the family patterns, the patterns that we encounter when we first start growing up. And it's very easy for these patterns to be passed down by generations, which is why we can often say, I lost my temper last night, and gosh, that was almost identical to what my parents would have when I was 2 years old. And the answer is yes, it's a very typical pattern we can fall into. Well, not the only pattern, but a typical one is we will sort of just repeat patterns for generations. Now, of course, the key the Chinese philosophers would emphasize is we don't have to do this. Like, we can consciously train ourselves to break out of these patterns. But if we don't, in all likelihood, yes, these patterns can continue for generations and generations.
Now, there are many who think that we're a very individualist society and very iconoclastic. We want to have our own way, our own styles. And you look at people today, I mean, the way they dress, the tattoos, the way they look, and everybody's trying to make a statement. And nobody wants to conform to anything. There are a lot of people who would think that following the path, what Chinese philosophers can teach us, we would really have to conform. Are we wrong about that?
We are wrong. Yes. So we indeed love to think we're these great individuals, and the way we show that is that we try to define ourselves as a unique individual. We try to figure out who we are. We present ourselves as a certain type of person. But of course, from the perspective of Chinese philosophy, they would say we're locking ourselves into a single thing, this single thing that I claim to be essential to me, and we're sort of play acting that self all the time. As you said, dress a certain way, act a certain way to define myself as a unique person. But then I have to keep playing that same person day after day, year after year. So what they would say is, well, think of yourself, on the contrary, as, again, a very messy thing. And what you're trying to do is break out of a single way of being. And a defined, unique personality is a single way of being. And what you want to do is break out of habits. You want to break out of single ways of being. You want to be, well, the kind of messy creature you are, but hopefully in an exciting way.
So let's talk about Confucius. Let's talk about ritual, things that may not seem normal to most of us and may seem false even to many, saying, well, why would I do that? Where is that going to lead me? Whereas my path, which is consumption and, this love of self and this escapism on Friday afternoon, I really let it all down. I mean, why is that not the path that a lot of people really can benefit from? Why are these rituals going to help us, and how?
Absolutely. So we tend to think of rituals as things that tell us what to do. So insofar as we love to be, as you said, unique individuals, always being true to who we truly are, we think of rituals as bad because it means we're not deciding for ourselves what to do. We're like following some ritual that's telling us what to do. Now, of course, from the perspective of Chinese philosophy, they would say it's the opposite on both grounds. So to begin with, when I'm acting normally in the world, am more likely just, again, playing out my typical habits and patterns, many of which are often very negative toward me and those around me. And I mistakenly think that's just me. And what rituals do, if that's the case in terms of description of what we're like, what rituals do is they break us out of that. So when you do a ritual for that brief moment, you become a slightly different person, seeing the world from a slightly different perspective, interacting with those around you in a slightly different way. And the reason that's important is that breaks us out of these usual patterns of interaction. And if you're doing lots of rituals in this sense, what you're slowly training yourself to do is really see the world around you and really deal with the world around you instead of simply repeating these same patterns that otherwise can completely define us.
To somebody who's listening to this America Trends podcast, we're talking to Michael Puett, The Path, and I've got to ask you, though, if some people are listening and saying, well, wait, that sounds like what happens when I go to church or synagogue or mosque, and I'm there and I'm involved in a ritual. I may not even understand exactly why. I may not even want to be there, but I'm there to satisfy somebody else, like my parents or what have you, and then I go back and I start living my life. How are these rituals going to be any different than some of the rituals I've been exposed to in my religious upbringing?
Yes. So what they would say, and they're of course dealing with a similar set of ideas when they're developing their own. So they would say, well, try to expand our understanding of ritual. Try to think of rituals as things we're doing all the time, not just the religious rituals, not something we do on a Sunday morning, for example, although it couldn't include that, but think of it as the daily ritual. So let me just give a very common but very mundane example, and these are the examples they tend to love, the daily ones. So you're a family. the family members come home. You've had a tough day. It's been rough at work, and your children had tough days at schools. And so you come home in a typical family dynamic. People are angry, they're anxious, they're tired, and they begin sort of taking it out on each other. And the same sort of fights that kind of play out every night occur. So, typical family. So then what happens? Well, if you're taking these ideas seriously, and I'll use some of their terminology, then what happens is you create a break. And what you do is you say, okay, time for dinner. And then you do little things to change the atmosphere. You set the tablecloth, you light candles, whatever it takes to sort of shift the atmosphere. And suddenly you're in a new space, and everyone is relating to each other, sensing each other, talking about their day. And the way you're doing this is you're doing a ritual in the Chinese sense of the term, right? You're creating a different atmosphere where you're relating to each other differently. Now, at first, you may not feel this is, to use our terms, authentic or sincere, because I may just be angry and want to yell at people. But nonetheless, the point is you make yourself, for that brief moment, interact well. And if you really do that, like, in other words, really play the ritual, then as time goes on, you get better and better and better at breaking the usual habit of coming home and yelling at your partner and children. And slowly that ritual creates the break that enables you to really begin relating to them in a better way.
You say that some of the philosophies of these Chinese philosophers will change your pattern of thinking from, quote, the ground up in unpredictable, unimaginable ways. Explain that to us.
Absolutely. So they would say these habits and patterns of thinking are really based in the whole daily way we act. And it results in what we physically perceive, like when we walk down the street. Most of what's out there we're not even noticing. When we're interacting with people, most of what's really going on around us we're not noticing. We're usually not even noticing the real people we're interacting with. We're just, again, responding by rote and by pattern. And so what they would say is a lot of who we think we are, a lot of what we think we're experiencing, we're actually not experiencing. We're just playing out these patterns. And if you really begin breaking these patterns, in other words, doing ritual in their sense, rituals that break us out of these habitual ways of being in the world, you suddenly begin to realize it is an incredibly complex world out there. You begin having much more fulfilling relationships. But getting to the heart of your question, it also begins changing you, because you don't simply become this person who's repeating these same habits. You begin really interacting, and that will change you, and it will change you in ways that you could not imagine. And it's a slow, gradual change, but when you add up the years and decades of our lives, you will become a radically different type of person just through these daily actions that you're taking. If you're really breaking these patterns, you will become something you right now could not imagine.
It's interesting, on a radio program that I hosted, I was talking about how we might look at some of our leaders and the relationships they've had with their fathers, and that would tell you just about everything you need to know about them, if they were abandoned, or if their father was an alcoholic, or if he was an overachiever. I mean, what they were looking to do in their lives. And you play out in a talk that I saw you give at Google a father-son relationship in this ritualistic sense. Explain that to us.
Absolutely. And let me just begin by saying I think you're absolutely right. I mean, these patterns, they oftentimes are based in our family. And again, we're often passive in these. We're just repeating patterns based upon where we abandoned, loved, etc. And so recognizing this as a huge part of what sort of makes us tick as human beings, in China they actually developed a ritual in which it was the father-son ritual, because father-son relations, as you said, can often be very defining for us. And what they would do is the father and son would be forced to walk into a ritual space and reverse roles. And so the son would have to look at his own father as if the father were his son, and the father would have to look at his own son as if that son were his own father. And each is therefore forced to see the world from the opposite perspective. Each is forced to interact with the other in a hopefully good way that role would entail. And by doing so, the argument is that physically being forced to see the world from the opposite perspective, you over time break these patterns between the two that can otherwise literally dominate the relationship from then on. And as you said, even affect very dramatically what sorts of human beings we become in terms of our other relationships, our occupations, everything. And the argument is that little ritual done every single day really breaks those typical patterns.
It's interesting. John and I went to a lecture recently because we both love dogs, and it was with a gentleman who's a dog listener. And he explained how we have to look at the pack and the alpha relationship and in all of our interactions with our dogs. And it said to me, boy, I have to be a lot more disciplined in the way that I deal with my dog in order to really understand that they want to be part of the pack and they want me to lead, but I'm generally, with dogs, not a leader. I mean, how disciplined do you have to be when you're thinking about the Chinese? We always think of them as extremely disciplined, and we think of Americans as being, well, not quite so.
Very much so. So one of the things they would argue strongly is the little things we are doing are creating relationships with us all the time. So as you said, if you're acting a certain way, you will bring out other sides of people, just as, if you watch dogs, the way dogs interact and the way we will interact with dogs. And same with humans. And usually they would say we do this unconsciously, just passively, because, again, these habits and patterns we fall into. But if you're really training yourself and really trying to train yourself to break out of these habitual ways of being, then you become aware of the degree to which this is the case. And then you become better and better at working at it. So you become good at sensing, if I do a certain thing in a certain situation, it will bring out a certain response. So then you can begin altering that, and you can begin acting in ways that really help others break their patterns, help oneself break one's own patterns, and you really begin creating radically different relationships. Now, getting back to the heart of your question, it is training, so it's discipline in that sense, but of course the key they would emphasize, which I absolutely agree with, is there's an incredible joyousness that comes when you really begin relating to people outside of these usual habits and patterns. And as an example of that, they have these wonderful quotes about Confucius, who's seen, of course, as one of the great figures at doing this. And he's described as this figure who's just incredibly joyous, just, loves being around people.
Yeah, we don't think of him that way necessarily.
Exactly. I mean, we think of him as this sort of ritual fuddy-duddy. But, of course, from this point of view, no, the rituals are what broke him from his usual patterns. And then through a life of training himself this way, by the end, he becomes this just incredibly joyous person. So the goal is, no, what you get out of this isn't discipline, although it takes discipline to get there. What you really gain is a kind of joyousness that relationships in the world around you.
I've been transitioning to a more casual lifestyle at this stage of life, and I find myself, and I think my wife has said it, that I'm becoming a lot more present in relationships. I'm tending to them more. I'm interacting more. I've always been pretty good at interacting with people. And I think you get back a lot of what it is that you put into any relationship and the way that you interact with people, the positive nature versus the negative or the casual aside where you really don't have time for people. How much of this is really about being more present in your life?
A huge amount. So one of the implications of just playing out these typical rote patterns, again, the way we typically live, is you're not really present in the world. You're not really sensing people around you. You're not really investing in people around you. Emotionally, you're not really connecting with people. And so what you're in part training yourself to do is to truly connect with people, to really be present for them, to sense them in all of their complexity, realize that things that you think of as faults are probably based in a kind of patterned relationship that you've in part created. And by being present there, you're working with them, and you're growing as a human being, you're helping them grow, and it's that intense engagement that you gain by breaking out of these usual patterns.
I noticed in the acknowledgments, and I've had her on my program a number of times, and she's a tough woman, Amy Chua, the Tiger Mom. And she said that reading your book and really internalizing it has made such a difference for her, and so many others have said that too. I mean, what are you seeing in your students? And when they come back to you a year or two later, how much of this has become rote? How much of this now is part of who they are?
A huge amount. I can say as a teacher, there's nothing more gratifying than having students years later write to me and just say that, yes, I've been really trying to put these ideas into practice, and it has truly changed my life for the better, that I have become a much, much different, much better, much more engaged human being, all because of just the daily work that, as they said, becomes the kind of joyous work. And so, yes, there's nothing more wonderful than that sense, or just even literally being told in so many words that these ideas have really transformed their lives.
How much did it change you as you started studying this? And some would say that Chinese philosophers are very different one to another. So if somebody was looking really to take that first step as part of the path, on the path, what would you suggest to them?
Yes. So what I would suggest is begin with the daily stuff. So begin with the daily stuff of the little breaks in your normal habits and routines, doing the equivalent of what they would call rituals, these breaks in which you try to see the world from a different way, a different perspective. This can involve very mundane things, just the ways you'll talk to a bus driver when you walk on the bus in the morning, the tones of voice you use, the ways you interact with people. Begin shifting those a little bit. What you perceive as you walk to work, walk a slightly different way. Train yourself to look at other things. And those little seemingly mundane breaks really begin affecting you over time. And as that continues to occur, then more and more of the implications of this become clear. And absolutely different philosophers will speak to different aspects of our lives. And yet what's powerful about them is that even though they're disagreeing amongst themselves, they're working from a very common sense of what we're like as human beings at both a negative level, our tendency to fall into these patterns and habits, but also a positive level. And so I would say begin at that level, and then as you begin developing, different philosophers will speak more to you in certain situations. So if you're in a leadership position, certain texts will speak more to you than if you're trying to think of how to build a better relationship with your mother or build a better relationship in a very immediate situation. So different philosophers will speak to you in different ways, but it's that initial work, that initial daily work, that will really open up the possibilities of employing these other ideas as well.
How different a person are you than you were when you started this journey?
Very. The difference it's made with me has been enormous. When I first started reading these ideas, I thought, well, I'm probably in the abstract. There's probably something to this. We probably fall into patterns and habits and may be true. But then I began doing the work of actually trying to break these things, and it only happens in work because you only, in practice, see what these patterns are. And yes, it became clear to me immediately just how habit-based I was and how I wasn't really seeing the world around me, how I wasn't really interacting with those around me. And so I've become a radically different person. Needless to say, I have a long way to go, but unquestionably, I am incomparably more excited by the world. I think I'm an incomparably better human being. I think I'm an incomparably more engaged human being. And it really comes out of just the daily work of altering how you are interacting with people.
What was the hardest thing for you to change?
By far, the hardest thing, and I suspect for many people growing up in America, this will be the same. The hardest thing was giving up on the idea that I really had some true self. I too had grown up with the idea that I should be trying to find myself and be true to myself and authentic to who I really am, and realizing that who I thought I was to a significant degree just these habits and patterns I had fallen into, and realizing that no, as I began altering myself just through these seemingly mundane daily activities, I started becoming a different person, certainly a better person, but a different person. And at first that's a kind of tough thing to recognize. We kind of become complacent in thinking that I should just be who I am. And it's tough to realize, no, who I am is a bunch of patterns that are often destructive to those around me. And that is a very, very, very tough thing to give up. And yet, when you do give it up, boy, does another world open up to you.
How important are things like yoga and meditation in all of this?
They can be incredibly important. Now, the one caution I would give is if one does something like yoga and meditation only in the form of saying, well, it's been a tough day or a tough work week, and so I'll do meditation and yoga to kind of calm myself down, and that way I can go back to the next day and return to the old grind. If you're doing it that way, that's dangerous, because actually what you're in practice doing is making yourself more able to deal with your patterns. In other words, you're making yourself more complacent in your patterns because you're kind of getting good at pushing away the daily anxiety to allow you to keep playing out your usual patterns. So the key with yoga and meditation, if you're really doing it, is, and I'll use the terms they will use themselves, the thinkers behind these ideas, you're trying to overcome the self. You're trying to break the self. You're not trying to make yourself more comfortable in your habits and patterns. You're trying to break them. And yoga and meditation is a powerful tool for doing this, but, it's a strong tool. And it really works, but it really works only if you realize, no, I'm going to become a different person by doing this. I'm not going to do this to calm myself down. I'm going to do this to break these habits and patterns that are otherwise dominating me.
Michael Puett, I can't thank you enough for being part of America Trends, the podcast. The book is called The Path, What Chinese Philosophers Can Teach Us About the Good Life. And I think you've helped me, certainly, and John, to really think about things in a different light. And I would really encourage people to read the book. And I thank you so much for coming by.
Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk with you.
If you like this episode of America Trends Podcast, will you please leave us a kind rating or a review on iTunes? John, is that too much to ask?
No, or even a comment. Give us in the
Anything.
comment section on the ones that you liked. And, you can also email me at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. And that's another way you can contact us with your ideas.
Don't forget, your review really is important to us. And, John, they may say, why? Why? Why is it so important? Well, the more
why? Tell us.
You're even asking that.
Why?
Well, the more you like us, the better placement we get, which then helps us improve our rankings and visibility so that more people can enjoy us. And the more people, John, you see how this is spiraling?
It's getting out of control there.
The more people who know about us and like our content, the greater chance we have to encourage advertisers to hop aboard. You see how it works now, John?
I understand now. That's very interesting.
And we don't want these folks who are listening to miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. I mean, we're recording tons of them, aren't we?
No, and they're all very interesting, and we got some really good stuff coming up.
Oh, we really do. But we want you to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com. And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms is @TrendsPodcast. We want to thank you personally for subscribing. In fact, John may have a very beautiful thank you gift. John, what is it? No? We ran out of them?
All out of gifts.
Oh, my goodness. Well,
Sorry
please,
about that.
please send us your ideas and questions for future episodes and topics on America Trends Podcast. We can't think of them all, right, John?
That's right.
I mean, my head's already exploding.
Oh, yes.
You see it.
I
Cloud
see it.
above. Is there an author you'd love to hear from? Or a subject you'd like to learn more about? Send us your ideas on Facebook and Twitter. You can direct message us at Trends Podcast or use hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have one that you want to give out. And we do not, right, John? We don't share our list.
No spamming, no list getting out. You just get our newsletter.
Absolutely. And you can access our full show archive on our website at americatrendspodcast.com. For more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on our upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. Oh, by the way, and John, this is really important, and you know
What is it? What is it?
Well, if you buy from Amazon, we have joined their Associates program. So you go to americatrendspodcast.com before you purchase, and you click over to Amazon from our Amazon store.
That's a very good point, because it doesn't cost them any more money to do that.
No, that's all built in.
And then we get a few pesos.
Yeah,
it helps
but
keep
and
the
look,
podcast going.
You know, if we get a small VIG, 2 or 3%, if you don't do it through us, you're just giving more money to Jeff Bezos. And he doesn't
Exactly.
need any more money.
He doesn't need it.
And he
That's
doesn't do
correct.
any podcasts, I don't think. So please, with no added cost to you, it helps us to bring you the content that you're enjoying. And thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Please keep listening.